we find that it's become more challenging to get through the permitting process. For example, the good old nationwide 27 that addresses ecological restoration projects without any specified acre limit, I would add. We're finding that that regulators are increasingly reluctant to go there and instead want to go the individual permit approach because of conversion of one kind of wetland to another, even if that's the overall goal is to achieve that kind of tidal wetlands. And of course, changing project description is a real villain, and these are both changes that emerge from an applicant who has either changed their mind about an aspect of the project or have done some further refinement and it changes the project, or one of the earlier agencies that we've worked with requires a condition of approval that dictates a change in the project that just ripples through everything else. So you find yourself in a constantly changing world and revisiting. That's where multiple drafts of biological assessments and other technical documents can come into play as you're trying to keep up with a changing project description. Granted, that's what it's all about. We want to get all this input. We want to end up with the best possible project to be implemented, but it can be a somewhat messy and inefficient process to get there. So not just wanting to talk about what the problems are, but a little bit about, what might help. Well, I'll start by saying more agency staff and more funding for regulation would be a good idea. Not so much here, although the state, as we all know, has been through some really tight budget times. But it seems to me on the federal level and in Washington, it seems like one side of the political aisle is more in line with more environmental regulation, and the other side seems left with their only solution is to cut back the funding or try to come back to funding for environmental enforcements. I suppose with the idea that somehow that would diminish the red tape, but in fact, I think what it does is just creates this kind of logjam and difficulty in getting through the process. So if we have the regulations in place, we need to have the funding to efficiently and effectively implement those regulations. More agency focus, less overlap, that would be desirable, but at least improved coordination, I think we should look at. I think one of my fantasy thoughts is that, and maybe this happened and I missed the memo along the way over the years, but I don't know if the key regulatory agencies have ever come together in a session and really talked seriously about streamlining permitting. Streamlined permitting has become something of an oxymoron, sort of like giant shrimp. But it seems to me that there's a lot of energy and attention, or too much energy and attention and distraction that goes around on all sides on projects that to me seem like they're more routine maintenance, replacement projects, a lot of energy going there. If we had more programmatic approaches, and I know that there's been some, I think there could be more aggressive moves in that arena, so that our collective energies could be focused more on those truly major, complicated projects that require the brain power that we need to bring to bear to come up with effective solutions. So some kind of, that would be sort of my suggestion for some kind of, really drilling down and seeing if there could be some kind of a DMMO-like group that would have a menu list of best management practices, that for those more routine maintenance, projects, that those could be addressed in a more expedited way. I'm glad to see, and we'll hear with my following speaker probably a bit more about this, thinking more proactively about bay fill. I know there's been a bay fill working group that has recently gotten together and initiated because in this era of sea level rise and in an estuary that is by most accounts sediment starved, we need to come up with some really effective and creative solution about looking at sediment much more than we already have as a resource and as even an in-bay source for sedimentation, but to support, more importantly, to support more aggressive, innovative responses to sea level rise that are non-structural and more natural systems oriented. And finally, the baseline, I think we need to we sometimes get caught in the box of we're just so fixed on the way things are now and comparing the impacts of a project that is going to go on for a number of years in the future, and we sort of compare the now with that instead of recognizing that the now is not going to stay the now. That by the time this project's in full swing and for most of its life, it's going to be a very different now. And I think Endangered Species Act is one arena where my regulatory staff tell me that they run into situations where it just seems like we've got to think a little more dynamically, especially if it's even if it's a project that just has restoration as its goal, that it's not even supporting a quote development project. Can we do any of these things? Really? Or are we going to go on like this? I think we can. I and ESA was very involved with the America's Cup endeavor when San Francisco was, quote, awarded the America's Cup event by Larry. Not you. Not you, Larry, but the other Larry. There were more than a few voices locally as well as in some of the competing states. Rhode Island in particular was competing to have the event return in Narragansett. And the chatter at that time, and that was early in 2011, was, well, there is no way the Bay Area is going to be able to get their act together, to coordinate, to get through all these environmental processes, to get all their regulatory permits. There's no way. So when all that falls on its face, we, Rhode Island, will be happy to host the America's Cup event. Well, we all did pull together, and we got through a very exhaustive, comprehensive environmental review. We got all the permits in place, and they were all in place within 18 months, and that event, of course, happened. So I know we can do it. We need to do it not just for those special, high-profile, politically important events, but for other projects as well, both the more routine projects, as well as these larger, more complicated projects, and put our brain power together to find those solutions. Thank you very much.
But I do want to thank Bay Planning Coalition for inviting me and all of our panelists and everybody here today. And I want to recognize that our chair, two people, our chair should be here somewhere, and I have not seen him. Is Zach Wasserman here? All right, he should be around somewhere. And also, my predecessor, Will Travis. Will, Trav, are you around? I've seen you. There he's over there. All right. So I just want to make sure that we recognize both of those individuals. So I'm going to power through the first slides and then talk a little bit at the end about how we're trying to do some of what Gary actually talked about. We all know what San Francisco looks like today. This doesn't happen every day, but it happens often enough if you live in either downtown or Marin for you to wonder whether it should happen every year. But this does happen every day. And we need to make sure that we recognize that when we talk about infrastructure around the Bay, we don't just think about the obvious infrastructure, folks, like the Port of Oakland, and that was a really great presentation that we heard earlier, but also different types of infrastructure, whether it be parks or whether it be recreational uses and so on. And we need to make sure that the waterfront clearly is for everybody. But the critical infrastructure is obvious, and all you have to do is really drive around, walk around, and look on the bay, and I think if you were ever to talk to somebody who doesn't really look at the bay very often, but have them sort of talk to you about what they think about the bay, you'll see a combination of different things, all of which surround infrastructure. The bay is a working bay, and that is what a lot of people don't really realize who don't deal with it every day. And I know that each of you deals with it every day, but most people don't. And I always like to remind people that we live in something which is not called the valley area. We don't live in the ridge area. We don't live in the mountain area. We live in the bay area. But yet 90% of the people who live and or work in the Bay Area probably don't see the Bay on a real regular basis, probably don't think about it on a regular basis. And so we need to keep reminding them that there is a geographic reason why we are all here. And it's not just that you can go to Alcatraz. I mean, we have a lot of reasons to want to live here. And sure, John can talk about and Sean can talk about how the Bay Area's GDP is so amazing, and it is, and we need to make sure it keeps expanding. But we also need to recognize, as Sean said, that one of the great reasons that we are so dynamic is that people want to live here because it is the Bay Area and not the mountain area. So we need to make sure that and in BCDC, that we conserve and develop continues to be really strong. I always try to, if you want a fun fact at a dinner party, all you have to do is mention to folks that over 40% of the gasoline that is manufactured around California actually is pretty much within BCDC's jurisdiction, and they sort of look at you and their jaws drop. But that is how integrated the economy and the natural systems are in the Bay Area. But I can't have a presentation in front of all of you without saying a couple things every time. The first of all is we always have to give thanks to these three ladies who created Save the Bay and essentially saved the Bay from what could have been, and this is nothing against John and the Corps of Engineers, a very small river ending in Palo Alto. So we do want to give thanks where thanks are due. And I also want to make sure that you all know that when Governor Reagan signed the legislation in 1969 to make BCDC permanent, he did on the recommendation of somebody you may remember, Cap Weinberger. Cap Weinberger was director of the Department of Finance for Governor Reagan, later, of course, became Secretary of Defense. He was known as Cap the Knife. And Caspar Weinberger looked at the governor and said, I think you ought to sign this legislation because it will actually provide more regulatory certainty for the private sector. And that really sort of, according to Clem Shute, the supervising AG at the time, basically tipped the scales in favor of the governor signing the law which made BCDC permanent. So we do have a huge challenge. I love the fact that we can say that over 150 public agencies of some sort have some kind of authority over at least one grain of sand that touches the water of the bay. 150. And what you have to figure out is how do you escape the tragedy of the commons? How do you make sure that we all do indeed work together so that Gary can retire being a successful, consultant, saying that we got everything through in 3 months. Well, I don't know that we'll get that point, but that's really the challenge because we are a regional regulatory and planning agency that's part of the state government, and our jurisdiction is pretty simple. At least most of the time it is. But as you all know, basically any project or major activities inside the Bay waters or within 100 feet, we have to deal with it. So, now comes the challenge. And it's the fact that, you know, and I took this from the old BCDC maps, which are also in the book that John has given everybody today, about the challenge of rising sea level. And here's some infrastructure that's at risk. How many of you are on Facebook? Great. How many of you have ever been to a refinery? How many of you have been down to the slough? How many of you who lives in Foster City? That's what I want to know. I mean, you all recognize what's at risk. And as a friend from PG&E declared it, it is a slow-moving emergency. You've all seen what the real risks are. You've seen part of this slide before. But the big things are the two questions. How do we have a bay-wide shoreline resilience program? And how do we as a state agency collaborate with local cities, counties, special districts that have land use authorities, much less the private sector and NGOs, for heaven's sake? How do we do that? Well, a couple examples of how we've done it. The Port of Redwood City needed a new wharf. So if you look on the picture, in the top part, you'll see a white wharf that's angled. They were very smart and figured out how to make it expandable. Phoenix Commons, a senior co-housing project, figured, well, we need to make sure that we're adaptable. And they were able to do so with the help, I should say, of the Army Corps of Engineers. And how many of you are looking forward to seeing the buildings rise at Treasure Island? Because it's going to happen. And Treasure Island has probably the most advanced and interesting way of actually adapting to rising sea level that we have seen so far. And as you can see in the left-hand upper quadrant, a lot of Treasure Island is essentially going to go undeveloped, and it's going to become a natural way to deal with rising sea level, assuming that the commission were to approve it. But one of the things that we have to really commend Chair Wasserman for is to think, okay, how do we get the commissioners more involved in making decisions with regard to rising sea level? So he created a working group that basically has three questions. What can we do? What should we do given reasonable priorities and unforeseen consequences? And how the heck are we going to pay for it? Well, what can we do? The options are limitless. We can be incredibly creative, and thankfully we live in probably the most creative place on earth. But what should we do, given our creativity, is actually just as hard, if not harder. First of all, we need to collaborate. We need to make sure that the BCDC Adapting to Rising Tides program is fully funded, because it's the only game in town. Essentially, Adapting to Rising Tides puts in one room neighborhoods, communities, the private sector, the public sector, and actually helps people in a very non-scary, very collaborative, very productive way talk about networks. And talk about the fact that this neighborhood is dependent upon that, and this community is dependent upon that, and the vulnerability is going to go this way, and so on. And by the end of the project, by the end of the time, you actually get strategies which are adopted by communities, which can actually provide shoreline resilience. Second, communication. Let's be honest. Nobody's figured out a way to talk about this yet. It took us 24 years as a region to build a new Bay Bridge after the Loma Prieta earthquake. 24 years. But we all saw what that earthquake did. Who here can see sea level rise? So how do we talk about it in such a way that doesn't paralyze people or say that's for the next generation? Private sector readiness. Let's face it, folks. There aren't many private sector businesses who are really prepared. PG&E stands out as an organization which is really trying and doing a pretty good job of it. And public infrastructure, interestingly enough, you talk to Caltrans, you talk to BART, and they actually are really starting to get it. BART actually has figured out a way to make sure that their capital program includes at all times questions about rising sea level. And then finally, equity. This is a really, really interesting bit for BCDC. I said it last year here in a different way, but I'll say it again. This is the first time that as BCDC looks at its policies, we are actively working with equity groups. come from underserved communities. Because if we do not figure out a Pareto-efficient solution to rising sea level that actually takes care of and actually recognizes the challenges that East Palo Alto, West Oakland, Richmond, parts of Solano County are actually facing, then the Bay Area is not going to accept it. And that's something that we have to do. Here's one of the really more interesting things that I've discovered. And that is that so much, of course, of rising sea level and how we look at challenges and how we look at possible solutions really deal with, of course, finance, valuation, and risk. So there's sort of a meme out there that says the private sector can really resolve this because the banks aren't going to lend money to folks who are going to build where the rising sea level is going to come, and the insurance companies aren't going to actually insure them. Wrong. Banks will lend money. Why? Because within 3 to 5 years, the note they hold is going to be sold to somebody else, which is going to have a portfolio, which is going to have a risk associated with it, which will incorporate the risks associated with rising sea level. The Bank of Fremont or the Bank of the West or Bank of America is not going to be holding that note, whoever gave that mortgage. Second, insurance companies. Insurance companies get this. They really do. The reinsurance companies especially. RMS especially. But they only insure for a year. Nobody insures for 30 years. So it's a 1 in 100 chance. So we have to ask, how do we look at continued development in vulnerable areas? And how do we protect shareholders, much less residents? How do you figure out how to link resilient property with non-resilient property? Okay, it's a nerdy way of saying it, but this is what I'm trying to figure out. BCDC permitted a new development where the old Pete's Harbor used to be in Redwood City. It's a really, really fascinating, marvelous development. Here's the big challenge BCDC has. It will be resilient. Pete's Harbor, the new Pete's Harbor, I think it's called Blue Harbor, will be very resilient. But it's going to be linked by a bridge that's going to be underneath water in 40 years or 30 years or 50 years or whatever it is. And the surrounding area in Redwood City isn't resilient. So is BCDC simply creating islands? And if we are, how does that make the Bay Area more resilient? So, in other words, how can infrastructure then, both natural or concrete, be valued and funded, and how can we use it to make everything more resilient? Enhanced infrastructure finance districts may be a way to pay for things. The San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority may come up with a solution. But one of the things we know we have to do, and Gary talked about this, is we have to look at our own policies. So Chair Wasserman created a second working group, which basically said, how do we look at our Bayfill policies and make sure that as we go forward, they actually become more and more relevant? Because remember, BCDC was created 50 years ago this September. 50 years ago. September 17th is our 50th anniversary. 50 years ago because the Bay was shrinking. Now the Bay is growing, and we have to make sure that we have shoreline resilience. But does the McAteer-Petras Act, which is our legislative authority, account for that? How can we and should we interpret current policies and use past practices to make sure that we can actually use dredged materials to create more wetlands? Are the policies consistent with our efforts to actually make the Bay Area more resilient, or would they frustrate them? And we're doing this not only as a working group of commissioners, but also with an advisory group that is incredibly diverse. People like John Coleman and Paul Campos from the Building Industry Association are sitting down with folks from the Audubon Society and Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're going to help us figure out how to do that. Because if we can't do it collaboratively and together, then we're not going to be able to get it done. So what we really have to do is re-envision the Bay. You know, John's predecessors in D.C., John Morrow's predecessors in D.C. had a vision in 1959 about how the Bay Area could grow and put all sorts of houses in the Bay. Well, that didn't happen. And so then the question sort of is, well, do you have to fill the Bay to save the Bay? Now, if that doesn't get your mind, going like this, if you're a BCDC staff member, nothing will. But what you have to think about doing, and what our staff is really working hard at, is trying to figure out how to promote and adopt both nature-based adaptation strategies, like the horizontal levee that you were alluding to and so on, and new infrastructure. And, the Port of Oakland, San Francisco Airport, and so on, all recognize that they're going to have to do various things, and we need to make sure that those things that they do are integrated with the rest of the Bay. So how are we going to do that? You have to have a regional plan. You have to define sustainable in the Sustainable Community Strategy in Plan Bay Area. You have to use transportation infrastructure and MTC as a nexus, because that's where probably 35 to 50% of the actual asset value is. It's in transportation. How do we work with MTC to use them as a nexus to implement the Adapting to Rising Tides program around the Bay so that everybody recognizes that networks exist? And what I mean by networks is pretty simple, actually. You can't fix one asset along the bay in one specific place without affecting all the other assets around it. SFO, sure, they could build levees and you'll increase the glide slope and you'll be able to land planes. But as Julian Potter, the John Martin's chief of staff, says, yeah, we can do that, but nobody's going to be able to get to SFO because 101's underwater. Well, if 101's underwater, what are you going to do with 101? You're going to try to move it? Well, you can't really move it because if you move it over to the west, you're in protected wetlands. So you have to figure out how the networks actually work. And you have to integrate those projects out there which are looking bay-wide. San Francisco Estuary Institute, Warner Chabot is sitting over there. The Habitat Goals projects, Bay Model 2.0 by Mark Stacy. The Kresge Foundation's proposal to try to make sure that underserved communities have a seat at the table. Local flood control projects, Mitch Avalon's folks, different county projects. You have to figure out how all that comes together. And so you use a total water level approach. You make sure that you know exactly how much water or can figure out how much water is going to come in. You have working groups, and you communicate and you advocate. And you can see that what you try to do is promote us, because we're the folks out there who are trying to make sure that we do it on behalf of all the other folks. And probably just as important and most important, one of the things that we have to remember is that time has an option value. That is, we don't have to solve the problem that's going to happen in 100 years. We have to solve the problem that's going to be happening over the next 30 to 50 years. And in doing that, we have to preserve the option of future generations to protect themselves and to adapt over the next 100 to 200 years, which means we cannot foreclose an option now or in the next 10 to 15 years that they may need to have in 50 to 100. It's a little bit of a puzzle. So I am more than happy, of course, to answer questions, and I truly appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Initially, Karen Arms, our acting regional administrator from FEMA Region 9, was to be here, but she could not make it. So, as always, they replaced her with two guys. Just, we don't measure up. Anyway, this is a defining issue for FEMA, and we are engaged in it. And you may ask how. And the reason, the answer on that is that this is FEMA's mission. Which I have taken a picture of so I never forget it on my phone. And our mission is to support our citizens and first responders to ensure that as a nation, we work together to build, sustain, and improve our capability to prepare for, protect against, respond to, recover from, and mitigate all hazards. My colleague, Ed Curtis, and I are representative of the National Flood Insurance Program, and you will hear about how this program moves us from an analysis of flood and the risk into the floodplain management and flood insurance portions of that. So Ed will go first, and I will round off. So Ed Curtis.
Thanks, Gregor. Hi, Ed Curtis. I'm a regional engineer at our regional office here in Oakland. I'm going to be talking about a couple of projects. Well, one project in particular that we have related to flood risk in the Bay. And I'm going to veer a little off course and talk about a project that's not being undertaken by FEMA. It's actually by the state California Geological Survey related to tsunami risk. Because really there's a couple of types of events that could result in flooding of major proportions in the Bay. One the type of flooding that FEMA normally analyzes and represents on its flood insurance rate maps, which are a regulatory product, that's the type of work that I'm involved in, is updating and maintaining those flood insurance rate maps, including those for the Bay. There's the state agency, Geological Survey, is doing some very interesting work that I'd like to just briefly touch on too before I turn it back over to Gregor, to familiarize you with the tools that they are going to be bringing to the table that you as decision makers should be aware of, as well as the FEMA maps that will inform you, I think, about these two aspects really of flood risk. The overarching program that FEMA has been involved in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years is called the California Coastal Analysis and Mapping Project. One specific piece of that is the San Francisco Bay Coastal Study. So that's what I'm going to be talking first about. It's a multi-year project. As you can imagine, there's quite a lot of work that goes into analyzing flood risk at the 1% annual chance level, as well as other levels. So that corresponds to what we commonly refer to as a 100-year flood risk. That's the standard that FEMA maps to as far when we represent flood risk on flood insurance rate maps. There's 9 counties that surround the Bay that have frontage on the Bay. They're in various stages of completion under this project. So beginning around the end of this year and moving into 2016, we'll move county by county and make those new maps effective. And I realize that this is going to sound a little naive after Larry's presentation. These maps are not future risk related. They don't directly reflect sea level rise, and they certainly don't go forward, are not forward-looking. But they're a snapshot in time. But significantly, the last time that FEMA took a snapshot of the flood risk around the Bay or anywhere generally around the coast of the United States was 30 years ago. So this has been part of a nationwide effort for FEMA to upgrade all of its flood insurance rate maps. I don't have time to give you a complete tour of the Bay to show you, but I do want to highlight a few areas. They've been mentioned a few times already this morning, so I think they'll be of interest. But what I want to show you is generally what our maps are reflecting as what is the current state of flood risk when we consider not just rising tides, but really what would be a confluence of events that would represent a worst, in fact, not a worst case scenario, but this 1% chance scenario. To get at that, we've gone back and reconstructed in some parts of the Bay 31 years of history of tides and winds and swells as well. And in some parts of the Bay, we've been able to go back 50 years to reconstruct that and then do the analysis to see when in those 30 years or 31 years or 50 years did we get that confluence of high tide, El Nino, and winds that are persistent at a certain direction that combine to cause these high total water levels that Larry referred to. We use that term as well, but when we transfer it onto a flood map, we refer to a base flood elevation. But it's the elevation above sea level that we would expect the inundation to occur at the 1% level. So just a couple of images here for the port of San Francisco and then for the San Francisco airport. It's been mentioned a few times that the levees surrounding, seawalls surrounding the airport are not continuous. They're not up to what FEMA would consider as federal standards for a levee that can protect adequately from a 1% 100-year flood. On the other hand, generally the infrastructure surrounding the port is going to be sufficient, at least at this point, before we account for sea level rise, to resist overtopping. However, as you can see, all of the wharves and piers and what have you are inundated by the 1% chance flood. So you're looking at for the harbor, those are flood heights on the order of 10 to 15 feet. At the airport, those are heights on the order of 11 to 12 feet. This is an image of the new mapping we're looking at for the Port of Oakland. Similar situation. There's no overtopping. There's no significant inundation of the land area of the port, but there's pretty significant wave heights right up against the ports, and all of the, again, anything that projects out into the bay is at risk from flooding under current conditions. Oakland Airport, again, I'm going to make sure this information is draft. These aren't the final versions of the maps, but our analysis does show this level of risk for Oakland Airport as well. Those levees are not sufficient as currently built. I'd refer you to, right now, a website, www.r9coastal.org, for more information about where the current status of this mapping is. After these maps go effective, FEMA has multiple ways for you to access the maps, access the digital data. I mean, emphasize that it's digital. It's going to be very useful in terms of use for planning. There's a tsunami website that CUGS has as well. Briefly, they've been very active in taking the lessons that they've learned and observed from the recent tsunamis, particularly the 2011 event in Japan, that was really a non-event for most of the California coast, including the Bay, but for certain areas, including Crescent City, that's where that picture is from. Maritime interests were significantly affected. They were fortunate they had warning time to get the fishing fleet, most of the fleet, out of the harbor before the event. But a lot of infrastructure damage, a lot of other things. There were lessons learned about evacuation. There's very little consistency up and down the state about how communities decided to initiate evacuation in response to the warnings from that event. And then there's been some lessons learned about land use. One of the products that they're working on it's kind of a complement, if you will, to the FEMA mapping, is new mapping that's going to be available related to probabilistic tsunami risk. In the past, this is really a developing science. They're coming a long way. I think it's going to be a very helpful product. The anticipation is that they will eventually have mapping for up and down the coast, including San Francisco Bay. Let's see, let me back up if I can. But anyway, they also identified there's a lot of issues that came out, and they're going to influence, that we think that'll be helpful to educate and increase awareness and planning going forward related to tsunami risk, direct impacts to structures, harbor infrastructure, the debris that is going to be developed, particularly sedimentation and scour. That was a real problem in Crescent City. It kept that harbor from being able to reopen for months. Not just because of the fact that a lot of sediment was deposited in the harbor, but because of the environmental evaluation and then permitting that had to go forward before they could actually move forward to dredge and dispose of that sediment. I don't want to take up any more of Gregor's time. Go ahead.
Like a tag team here. Okay, I'm going to take a guess it's that pic. No? Ah, there you go. So you've heard from Ed how FEMA produces maps, and we distribute them to the world. This is under the rubric of the National Flood Insurance Program. The world comprises of a whole host of stakeholders. Lenders use them to make determinations on whether structures are going to be required to carry flood insurance. Insurance companies use them to determine the insurance rates that they'll charge for that structure. Cities adopt these maps and an ordinance to locally enforce what the maps will show to guide future land development. And the 30,000-foot thing that you need to know in this, most of that is how you build to identify the risk. And it's essentially get the lowest floor of that structure up above the base flood elevation, that water surface level of the 1%, or I won't say 100-year flood, oh, I just did, the 1% chance event. Just get the floor up above it and help protect that structure. The third leg is then that FEMA makes insurance available. There's a National Flood Insurance Fund. Into that, premiums are paid. Out of that, claims are made. And as you may know, we are a little bit in debt on that. Sorry about that. 2005 was not a good year for us with 3 storms. Then there was Hurricane Sandy. So the program itself is about $24 billion in debt. Anyway, Challenges, and I'm jumping ahead on the slide, map accuracy. As Ed said, we are using the best science that we have for a 1% annual chance event and some scientifically based defendable data on what we could expect on a 1% chance. But keeping those maps current is a problem. 30-year gap between our last big study and now, and there's a lot happened in the Bay on the infrastructure side in those 30 years. Community compliance becomes an issue. If the maps become more and more out of date, the community is still using those maps to determine how to build and where to build. And if we don't keep the maps up to date to the current risk, they're building infrastructure that is being put into harm's way. Third, the solvency of the fund. The fund was designed to break even in an average loss year. As the government, we're not a for-profit organization. So taking in as much in premiums as we paid out in claims as that average loss, but as we have since 2005 suffered very large payouts. We're $24 billion in debt. We're paying that down. We're now only $23 billion in debt. But how to keep the program solvent has been on Congress's mind for the last couple of cycles of Congress. Therefore, I only have 3 minutes left. Oh my goodness, we're going to have to go through this then fast. A couple of laws were passed. We'll talk about that. You can ask me questions before. I've got a couple of vacation snapshots just to mirror what has been said here. What are we looking at in future and what do we have right now? This is Jack London Square at low tide. This is not scientific. This is anecdotal information. What these slides are going to show is what we have the difference between low and high tides. If you are familiar with the king tides that we get in the winter, when the moon, the earth, the sun are all in alignment, that pulls tides higher. Same spot, January, this was the king tide. This is the kind of forward-thinking posture we need to have to make sure that we're not building an infrastructure that is set to fail. This is particularly dear to my heart on the compliance side because if structures are along V zones, velocity zones, coastal, we mandate that they must be built so that that lowest element of the horizontal member is at or above base flood elevation. Low tide, high tide. We've still got some ability to meet that. However, king tide, those elements are now in water. Also bear in mind, all of these pictures are during the day. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. There's no rain here, there's no runoff from rain, there's no wind-driven waves. These are all calm. This is Colma Creek, low tide. High tide, watch that land area on the left. That's gone at king tide. An example of, in a micro world, what happens and how we need to keep, as Larry was saying, we need to keep the bay as a natural sponge for those effects. This is this wastewater treatment plant in South San Francisco at low tide. At high tide, not that, the sun was in my lens, come on. We have about 4 feet on the embankment there. At king tide, 2 of those feet are gone. So we're looking at the possibility that today's king tide events are tomorrow's high tide events. So what are tomorrow's king tide events? Are they higher? Are they going to be the flood stage events that we have? And if so, how do we protect our infrastructure from what would be predictable 3 times, 3 days of high flooding events? And how do we work that one? Again, that's land that goes underwater. This I like. The Colma Creek at Point San Bruno. At low tide, that area on the left is environmentally sensitive. Keep out. Okay, my dog was not in there. He was on a leash. At high tide, still dry. Not so much king tide. So again, in microcosm, we've got where are we building and why. The question of how we look forward is in this, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, or the FFRMS. This was signed recently by the President. It amends what we already have from the executive order, and it tells federal agencies to use a management standard in advance of what we already have. And the 3 methods that we have here on this slide are this. If we have climate-based studies that utilize how do they put it, actionable data and methods, use it. If we have a flood insurance rate map, use that base flood elevation and go 2 feet above it. Not just high, but then pick that spot from that 2 feet out and expand the area that is to be flooded, and don't build there if you can avoid building there. The third is use a 500-year event, or the 0.2% chance. So these are what what the federal agencies, all 55 of us, I think at last count, are required to use now. The question is, how do we implement it? And in addition to what has been proposed there, critical actions, as I said before, 2 feet above BFE. If it's a critical action, 3 feet, not 2. Every agency gets to define what a critical action is, and use nature-based approaches, use that environmental piece as a solution to this. We are currently in a comment period on how that implementation will happen. That will expire on May 6th. These are the access portals by which you can put your comments in. I'll leave this up for a moment. What's important if you do it electronically is to use that FEMA ID number, that docket number, ID FEMA-2012-0006. We still accept them by snail mail as well, and that's the address you've got on the right. My time is way up, and I'm going to get somebody very mad at me, so thank you very much.
My name's Andrew SABEY. I'm a partner with Cox Castle Nicholson. I'm a land use litigator. And before I bookend Gary's foreboding comments about the regulatory world, as just a quick aside, I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm the incoming chair of the East Bay Leadership Council. And on behalf of the East Bay Leadership Council, of which John Coleman is a board member, I wanted to applaud the Bay Planning Coalition on convening this and showing leadership in this arena. And I see a number of our board members out there, and I just wanted to say on behalf of East Bay Leadership Council, well done. And with a nod to my counterpart, Dave Ivester, for chairing this organization. So in the program, it says environmental challenges, but if you see lawyer, then you should probably realize you're talking about the legal environment. You've heard about the physical environment, that's challenging enough. What I wanted to focus on, because when you're going to talk about the legal environment and what challenge faces anybody that wants to do anything in California, it always starts with CEQA. It's the sort of ultimate 4-letter word, and right now, CEQA is always a risk. It's kind of we're all in some ways kind of inured to that being a risk that you face as someone who wants to develop anything. There's sort of a unique point in time right now in California. There are 9 cases in front of the California Supreme Court that address CEQA. This is an historic high. Historically, there's 1 or 2 cases before the Supreme Court. They have shown a unique appetite for granting review on cases addressing various aspects of this law. And in particular, it comes at a time when there's been a huge turnover in the court. So of all of those 9 cases for which review was granted, 8 of them were granted before there was a major change in the court. We have 2 new appointed justices. They are complete blank slates when it comes to their judicial philosophy. One coming out of the federal government, out of the Obama administration, and one coming out of the Stanford Law School. They're brilliant lawyers. I have to sort of acknowledge my own age and say they're brilliant young lawyers. One of them is 38 years old, no pedigree at all. So we are looking at the 9 Supreme Court decisions addressing CEQA and a real sort of blank slate on a huge chunk of that court in terms of how they're going to approach the statute and what it means to those who have to work in it. So, if Gary figures out how to facilitate and expedite your permitting process, don't worry. You still have years of litigation after that. So, you should all take comfort. Yeah, nothing's going to go smoothly. Of the 9 cases, and they're all, because they've reached the Supreme Court, they're all significant. I wanted to focus on 3 or 4 that I think are of particular relevance to this group. And it's not because I'm handling all 3 of them, although it turns out that my firm has a hand in all 3 of these. But I do think they do represent kind of the hinge points that are going to be of greatest significance when you look at what industry in the Bay Area is trying to accomplish or trying to survive and accomplish. The first one is, I think, a sleeper for a lot of the normal CEQA nerds out there are typically faced with, it's about development, it's about cities and counties and residential, and can I put a new subdivision in or can I do infill? and what's going to happen to me when I try to, approach the city council with the angry mob that wants it not to happen. The first one, though, it's Friends of Eel River versus the North Coast Rail Authority, and it's an interesting case because it's the first time that the Supreme Court is going to deal with whether or not a federal law can preempt CEQA's application to an activity within the state. Now, in this case, it's the operation of a railroad, actually, up in the North Coast, and it's, it has some significant implications for a lot of the sort of maritime industry. Obviously, shipping in and out of the bay is predominant, or should be predominantly by rail. Incoming into California, there's a lot of product that should be shipped by rail. This case gets to the Supreme Court because the case that we were handling for the North Coast Rail Authority and our client, the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Company, the applicant here and the operator of the rail, our court agreed with us that CEQA is preempted by the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. But the court addressing a CEQA challenge to the High Speed Rail Authority said CEQA could be preempted, but there's this obscure doctrine called the market participation doctrine that basically wipes out preemption for California opponents of CEQA projects, so no preemption. And it's sort of a collision now before the Supreme Court. I think huge risk if the court says that federal law does not preempt. I guess the one perhaps optimistic note would be that and as an advocate, I have to tell you that, of course, we're right and CEQA was preempted. But I do think that there's an opportunity here to see the court rein in CEQA in this context and perhaps provide some certainty for rail operators. And there may be, I think, some other industries that could benefit from seeing some of that clarity. So it's a risk, but there's a potential out there that maybe something good could come out of that. Another case that, switching gears here to air quality, that I think is of great significance in the Bay Area is a case called the California Building Industry Association versus the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Because that's unpronounceable, we call it CBIA versus BACMID. And this is a case that, although it rose in the Bay Area, obviously has statewide implications about the application of CEQA. So everybody, I think, sort of that's touched this statute or been around project approval understands that what you're supposed to analyze is the impact of the project on the environment. As Gary mentioned, you're changing the baseline. So you're coming into an area, you're doing something, it's going to have an impact. Go measure it. What impacts you're having, if they're significant, you got to mitigate them if you can. If it's feasible, you have to mitigate to less than significant. And then you can go forward and be sued and see if you've done it right. But at least you can get through the project approval process. So the question that this case presents is, do you have to also analyze the impact of the existing environment on your project? So if you're building a project in a place that's already despoiled at some level, maybe it has air quality impacts, maybe it's threatened by sea level rise. Is that a CEQA issue? Nobody is denying that all of the issues that present themselves in an existing environment are legitimate environmental issues. But the question is, do you have to try to deal with it in an EIR, and do you have to pretend to mitigate for the existing environment when you are going forward to build within it? And I think for industry that obviously occupies and builds and wants to develop in a lot of areas that are not pristine, right? We are not talking about greenfield operations. We're talking about working around the port. We're talking about bringing more people into that area. Do you have to be concerned about, well, if I'm bringing employees into an area that has bad air and they're there 8 hours a day for 40 years, is that a problem? Do I have to put that in my EIR? And what's my mitigation measure? And I think on the other side of that, acknowledging that for industry, if, for example, home builders who are really at the brunt of this lawsuit, right? It's in terms of if you want to do urban infill and you're being told, well, you have to figure out how to mitigate for the fact that you're next to a freeway. If that is deemed to be not part of CEQA, which is what we're advocating, is there going to be more pressure to clean up the air so that that's not an air quality impact that people are having to live next to? And I mean, that could be a burden that falls back on those who are causing that pollution. it's something to think about down the road. Sticking with air quality for just a moment, I think there's a case out there that's been a little bit of a sleeper, I think, in the industry. It's called Sierra Club versus Fresno, and it addresses a question about how detailed, if you are having to analyze your impact on air quality, how detailed does that have to be? Do you have to get into, okay, if I put this project here, I can tell you that it's going to add X amount of, ppm of fill in the blank toxic air contaminant. Do I have to tell you that I think that's going to get down to 5 additional sore throats and an increase in asthma of, for 6 guys on the bad day? How far do you have to go? And so it's going to be an interesting case, which I think, depending on how the court deals with that, could have some implications for how onerous Gary's job is, and of course, for those who are trying to do these projects, how much it costs to run Gary and his team, ever further into the weeds of trying to figure this stuff out in advance. And no discussion of the CEQA risks presented to California would be complete without talking about greenhouse gas emissions and what role CEQA is going to play in the state's goals toward reducing our greenhouse gas emission component. There are actually 2 cases before the Supreme Court that touch different parts of CEQA and greenhouse gases. The first one is a Newhall Ranch case out of Southern California. It is picking up a question that this is a good bookend here for the consultant to the lawyer, so from the front end to the back end of this process. The baseline question: if you are building a project and you're building on a greenfield site, right, which currently does not emit or contribute much in the way of greenhouse gases because it's ag land and underused, and you're proposing to house tens of thousands of people there, do you have to say, I'm going from 0 to this enormous number, and therefore it must be dramatically significant and almost unmitigatable? Or if you impose upon that new development all sorts of mitigation measures that you can project that development will be 29% more GHG resistant or produce 29% less GHG than it would have if I didn't build it in the way I proposed to build it. So AB 32, which set out California's goals for reducing our GHG contribution, said you got basically what CARB has said is you got to get 29% better than business as usual. And you say, well, I'm getting 29% better than business as usual. And the other side says, no, you're building 20,000 new homes and all this population. It's a huge number. It's going from this little to this huge number. How can you say that's 29% better than business as usual? You've got to look at from where you started to where you are. So the Supreme Court is going to be asked to resolve that conundrum. And very recently, just probably in the last month or so, they granted review in a case out of San Diego. It's the Cleveland National Forest versus Sandag. But this is a challenge to San Diego's sustainable community strategy. They were the first in the state to adopt their SCS. And their SCS, of course, has a regional transportation program component, the RTP component, right? And it's supposed to look out this extended period of time about how are they going to reduce their GHG contribution through their transportation planning. And the question is, how far out do you have to project and analyze and mitigate for your GHG reduction? Right now, state law says you got to go out to 2035. The question in this case is there was an executive order issued by Governor Schwarzenegger that said, I want 80% reduction in GHG by 2050. And the precise legal question is, well, is that a standard now that you have to adopt as someone who is analyzing your GHG contribution? Do you have to say whether or not you're going to hit 80% by 2050, or can you stick with what the actual law is, what AB 32 and the guidelines adopted by CARB? And so the tension between whether a governor's executive order becomes state law, which is now binding on everybody, or whether it was just an executive order, which is sort of has its own little place in in our organization of government. So, you know, that's a case that if it turns out that everyone has to try to adhere to that executive order, look out, because Gary's job just got a lot harder. And it's going to take a lot longer to figure out how to do that. So I see that I am just about out of time. I wanted to mention one other thing. So stepping away from the Supreme Court, which is enough of a risk, there's one other thing out there on the horizon that gets a lot of discussion in the residential industry, and that's the change from level of service analysis, which is how we've always done our traffic analysis, right? How are you impacting the level of service, versus the new regime, which is going to be how many vehicle miles traveled are you going to induce in your project? And I think for industry, especially that involves a lot of shipping and whatnot, this is something that really needs to be thought about and engaged in, because I see that as an issue that we've looked at it from the residential a lot, but I think from industry, there's a lot of risk there as well. So on that cheery note, I'm going to yield it to Amy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Gary, Larry, Ed, Gregor, and Andrew. Unfortunately, actually, we're about 5 minutes over our time, so we're going to have to collect your blue cards, and the panelists get a chance to actually write their responses, and we're going to post them on our website. So apologize for that, and I know you all wanted to engage in discussion, but we want to get on to lunch, and we have some other topics to go through.